Welcome everyone. Again, this must be sort of fifth, sixth networking event I've been to. This will follow general format. Today I'm going to be presenting just for 10, 15 minutes on sort of social infrastructure. And it's basically, I'm sort of a warm-up act so that we can open up the floor and just have a general discussion about social infrastructure, particularly projects, etc. you may be involved with, or this space you're working in, what you're seeing in the market. And it's just a chance to get to meet others as part of the Project Finance Institute. So a little bit about myself. I mean, as Taya mentioned, I am part of the teaching faculty at Project Finance Institute. So lots of the courses you'll see online or in person. I do a lot of the teaching with Kenny, but that's only part. My actual day job, I work for an organisation called Scottish Futures Trust. So this is a government-funded agency. A bit of background about myself: I'm a chartered accountant and finance specialist with 20 years working in sort of corporate and project finance as well as banking. So Pete Lyons on the session today. We worked together for several years, so it's lovely to see you, Pete. And within SFT, I am largely focused on looking at social infrastructure. So a little bit about SFT, what it does. So I mentioned it's a government-funded agency, and basically we were established in 2008. We're meant to be an infrastructure centre of expertise, works in collaboration with lots of different partners across the market, including private sector, financiers, funders, as well as public sector like local authorities, Scottish Government. And our main, I suppose, elevator pitch would be to say we have government policy. What are they trying to achieve objective-wise? And we look to sort of set up and facilitate creation of commercial, legal, financial, technical frameworks, converting some of those policy objectives into deliverable projects on the ground. This is sort of a snapshot from our website, and I'll show it again later because there's lots of freebie information on there, because as a government-funded body, lots of the information we provide, it's all out there for everybody to use. And so I'll direct you, because there's a lot more information you'll be able to glean from the website than I can actually talk about in this first sort of like 10-15 minutes. So this little bit here just gives a snapshot of different areas we're involved with. We look at one of the infrastructure finance and programs. Myself in particular, I'm involved in the net zero public sector and heat decarbonisation program. So in Scotland, got the task of trying to decarbonise all of Scotland's buildings, which is going to cost overall 33 billion, and big challenges. Scottish Government doesn't have a lot of money, and it's how can it leverage in private sector money to support that decarbonisation. So I'm focused on a particular sort of area within net zero buildings, but you can see here we cover all sorts of infrastructure assets. However, we're here to talk about social infrastructure. So what is it? Well, I suppose in its broadest terms, it covers sort of like the construction and maintenance of facilities that support social services. So in the main, that's going to be things like medical facilities, hospitals, schools, so education, schools, universities, student accommodation, as well as housing. And you can expand that as well to include emergency and response services, as well as sort of justice and leisure facilities. So, but that's more sort of, I suppose, an asset description. You could also expand it a little bit further to say, well, really, social infrastructure covers a range of services and facilities that really meet local and strategic needs and contribute to a good quality of life. Helping foster and generate new relationships, encouraging public participation and civic action, overcoming inequalities within society, and particularly following COVID, trying to generate resilient communities. So alongside some of the more formal provision of services like having hospitals and education, there are more informal networks and community support that play an important role in the lives of people. So social infrastructure you can think of as being a little bit broader than just these tangible assets. So why is social infrastructure important? What are the benefits? You can see here, but I suppose the underlying key thing is that it's important for the economic development of a nation or local community and development of society's quality of life. Enhances social well-being, improves economic growth, alongside all of the basic services. And here we've got these titles, let's think about market impacts, it's helping unlock private sector capital and investment. Look at demand side, economy impacts, we're trying to stimulate the creation of new jobs, purchases through the construction phase. And then supply side economic impacts, we're trying to increase productive capacity in the economy, as well as the productivity of our labour force, improving the skills, particularly in Scotland for us at the moment, where Scotland historically has been heavily reliant on the oil and gas industry, and there's what we call a just transition, trying to move towards Scotland being a leader in net zero. So social infrastructure can really help in that regard. Again, just a little bit more of an extension on some of the benefits here, and it's as well as the hardcore economic benefits we saw on the previous slide, is thinking about, particularly on the right-hand side of this slide, some of the more sort of ethereal outcomes, such as improved health and well-being, reduction of crime, more engagement amongst the public. There's also the associated fiscal outcomes, which are important for governments in terms of taxes, cost of local services, and again, very importantly, environmental incomes. One of the key aims everybody's aiming for at the moment is reducing emissions, trying to increase biodiversity. But social infrastructure can provide a fabulous bedrock for helping deliver some of those outcomes. So what are the typical models? So the next couple of slides, I'm just going to give some very brief examples of how these types of projects are being financed. Now, for many of you, this may be a very typical structure or slide looking at public-private partnerships. So this is where the public sector partners with private sector to help design, build, finance, operate and maintain lots of these buildings, such as schools or hospitals. And the sort of little diagram on the left here just shows what a typical PPP contract structure will be. You have a government or local municipality or local authority which will be contracting with what is a ring-fenced special purpose vehicle, typically under that would be the main contract, and that special purpose vehicle tends to be non-recourse limited financing vehicle, which contracts with the engineering and procurement contractor, i.e. to build the fabric of a building, as well as the operation and maintenance contractor who will provide all the services for making that facility available. So that is sort of the creation of the asset and how it's maintained. And then the right-hand side here, that cost needs to be financed, and that's generally provided by way of senior debt, lenders, and equity investors. And Pete and I have done lots of these deals, and that financing can take any form from traditional vanilla debt, bank being provided by a lender such as Bank of Scotland or Bank of America, through to could be even more esoteric type financing. So I was involved in a deal which looked at using bond financing, and we had the public issue of a retail price index linked bond on the London Stock Exchange as financing tool to help fund a series of schools up in Dundee. The diagram on the right just shows some of the flows of the cash. We've got service payments coming from the project company to the EPC contractor and the O&M contractor. And then on the right-hand side, we've got bank loans coming from the lender and ongoing senior debt service payments being made to them. And from the equity investors, we'll have dividends as well as probably payments through things like shareholder loan structures. And then we have the government contracting body who will generally pay a subsidy and availability payment, typically through what's called a unitary charge to that special purpose vehicle. And ultimately, the users, us as a public, will be using those facilities. I suppose the simplest one, if you think of a leisure facility, you could be paying your fee at the door to access that facility, and in exchange you're getting access to the gym halls, a swimming pool, etc. So that has been a very traditional sort of infrastructure model, started sort of early 90s, and is very, very mature in the UK. Very well established market, and over time that has sort of been refined to look at other different models. So in Scotland, what that's been sort of extended to something called non-profit distributing model. So that superseded what is traditional PPP projects, and a lot of, I suppose, in essence, what that was trying to do is create standardized contracts, which made procurement of facilities a lot easier and quicker to undertake. Having simplified, standardized contract, the market got used to those forms of contract, and it was a lot easier to accelerate and get projects through the pipeline. Other benefits of this is that, I suppose, historically, PPP, you'll have had lots of, I suppose in the press, large returns going back to private sector investors. And this mechanism, NPD, was a way of sort of fixing, I suppose, the level of returns, which were going back to the private sector investors. And importantly, in these structures, there was having someone called public interest director sitting on the board, because historically there wasn't necessarily a clear sight of the governance structures in place over these PPP transactions. So going to an NPD model, there'd be a public interest director who could sit on the board, give sort of, I suppose, monitor the performance of a project, make sure the project's working in accordance with some of the underlying NPD principles. I suppose they would bring an independent and broader view to the project company's board, and they can also monitor conflicts of interest. But really, the whole aim of this NPD structure was to improve the competitive tender processes for transactions and attract value for money financing. it was also importantly, and we'll move on to this, is focus on wider community benefits as well as economic stimulus. So as well as the actual project, thinking about, would there be apprenticeship schemes introduced? What's the impact on the local community? Are there additional skills and supply chain expansion? What's the use of local contractors being employed in the contract just to help stimulate that local economy? And also by having sort of this consistent structure. I mean, one of the important things was that actually having the same sort of suite of contracts and sort of design principles, it meant each iteration would be slightly cheaper for building a new school or hospital. And so actually there's accumulated savings, which would mean that, more schools or hospitals could be built. So that was quite a sort of an extension of what was traditionally public-private partnerships. We now sort of leave those little bits away. So not NPD, an extension of public-private partnership. Some other models which are sort of a little bit broader than traditional PPP, and that's sort of looking at something called tax incremental financing. And you're thinking, what on earth is that? Well, this is a good example would be an area in Scotland called Grangemouth, where there's a big oil refinery and there's lots of large-scale industrial businesses there. And what government will think is, well, we would like to encourage more investment in this area. So they were sort of looking at or thinking about enabling infrastructure such as improved roads or digital infrastructure, or maybe actual net zero heat supplies to buildings. And the thought was, well, if government or local authorities can provide the financing for this enabling infrastructure, that will attract new businesses to the area. And particularly in Scotland, businesses have to pay a tax in the form of non-domestic rates. So those non-domestic rates can help then fund those original financing costs. So the way to think of it is, it's called but for this enabling infrastructure, these non-domestic rates would never arise. So it's a way of thinking about investing in an area where the enabling infrastructure attracts businesses, they pay non-domestic rates, and that helps cover the original financing, which might be provided by a local authority or government. That again has been expanded a little bit further into something called a growth accelerator model. And this is not really sort of an infrastructure investment model per se, but rather a city centre initiative that stimulates and creates the right conditions for different types of public and private sector investment to be made. And its main aim is to enhance economic growth, increase job creation, and also create developer profit share opportunities. And we've got two examples here, again, in Scotland. One here on the left is St James's Centre, which is quite close to Princes Street, but it's a huge area which has been redeveloped, and basically City of Edinburgh put in 60 million of financing to support development of this site. So it's got leisure facilities, shops, accommodation, offices, hotels, and by putting in that investment, they've managed to crowd in 850 million of private sector investment be made into the heart of the city. And actually the money from City of Edinburgh Council, some of that will be funded by government money look at, and local authority looking at what the wider economic impacts are. So what's been the increase in the number of jobs? Can you get a GDP measure of the increase in increase in the economy within the city of Edinburgh for this particular area? So it's not a specific asset. It's more looking at an area and all the different assets which come together to form a place. Another example where this growth acceleration model has been applied is the Victoria and Albert Museum in Dundee. Again, it's exactly the same type of model where investments being made, it's attracted and improved economic growth, it improved the skills and supply chain, helping grow the economy. And so some of the financing is then being supported through funding from government and local authorities arising from these improved outcomes. So that's sort of expanding a little bit further. The last thing I just really wanted to then touch on before we can just actually properly get to networking and just having a general chat is we've gone from looking at individual projects, hospitals, schools, could be toll roads, to looking at areas, and there's a large or a significant movement to looking at things called place-based investment. Because actually, when you're looking at an area, what you want to do really is say, well, you know, what's important here? What's important to a particular area we live in? And knowing what needs to be done with the buildings, how can you be more joined up in the way they're used or interconnected? That should help develop programs or investments, which in turn are helping support the broader government and local authority policy ambitions and targets. So this has been a focus of colleagues at Scottish Futures Trust in looking at how do we go about doing this, and it's still early stages. So there's been a lot of work on trying to create like a framework guide for how should people, particularly local authorities and governments, think about areas. How should they invest? How do they need to change? And having a framework and guidance on how to look at that in more detail. Now, there's a whole raft of information on this, which I will escape now and just show you, because I want to get to more of the main body of having a chat and networking. All of these slides I will all get put onto the platform after we finish today, and you'll be able to access them. But what I wanted to do is just now highlight or show you, if you want to find out a bit more about social infrastructure investment and particular areas, you can just Google Scottish Futures Trust. You'll see there's all the different areas involved with in terms of investments. We've got infrastructure, finance and decarbonisation, development and housing. And all of the information on here is free and available for you to use. But for instance, talked about place-based investment. You could go on to here, you click on place, it will come through, tells you a bit more about place-based decision making, but there's also case studies you can look at, and also relevant sort of publications which can just give you a lot more information about that particular area. So there's lots of information freely available for you to have a look at. make contact with myself either through the platform or directly. But that was just a very brief overview of social infrastructure investment. Really, it was just a warm-up act for us to be able to chat more widely about areas of social infrastructure investment you may be involved with. So what I would like to do now, I suppose, is open it up to the floor. There may be some questions you want to ask me first. I suppose actually in terms of having discussions, if you just want to introduce yourself, what your background is, and let's just have a chat.
Sounds great. Thank you, Toby. The only question I can currently see in the chat is whether you'll be sharing the slides.
Yes.
Which I think, yes, we are happy to do that. And we will be uploading them in the community together with the recording. Normally, we aim to have that up within the next 24 hours. So you guys should be able to find it inside the webinar recordings area. And yeah, I mean, if we should go ahead and just introduce ourselves, let us know if you are in any way involved with social infrastructure, and if there's any questions that you have for Toby specifically, please feel free to do that.
Lewis has put his hand up.
Yes.
Hey, Lewis.
Lewis,
Hi,
feel free to...
Hi, Toby.
Yeah.
Hi, T. Nice to see you once again. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfectly.
Great. Thanks so much once again for reconnecting. At least had the privilege of meeting both of you at Battersea last time during the networking event.
You too?
Yeah. So maybe for the rest that I haven't met. So I'm currently finalizing my master's in finance, and I'm in the development finance space with IFC. And mine is just an observation. And I've had the privilege of now being in the UK for almost now 3 years. And I'm actually seeing a couple of new bills, especially on my side, that is Uxbridge. And there is a new whole setup, like a town or so, that is actually coming up there. So my point of clarification for you, Toby, is, will this also follow the same social infrastructure? Will it follow the same type of financing like the one that you've actually just shared with us for Scotland, and also the other ones that are actually being integrated into the entire ecosystems across different cities, across different towns in England? And also, how does this resonate with the taxation that in terms of council taxes that are normally collected by the councils of different boroughs? So thanks for that. Yeah.
That's a bit of a toughie, Lewis. So lots of the stuff we're involved. I can't really comment on England because they will have lots of the projects like that Uxbridge Centre. Presumably, is that a community centre or some? It will probably be some form of PPP type model, which will have been used to finance and fund it. Now, in terms of the use of things like TIF and like growth accelerator models, I have no idea beyond the boundaries of Scotland what has or hasn't been used. It would surprise me if it hasn't, because it is quite a useful model. Because the funding through, particularly for TIF, increases in things like non-domestic rates can actually help finance that an upfront financing cost. But I'm not sure, Lewis. I can't help you on that one, I'm afraid. I mean, I might ask, actually, because I know, Peter, you're involved in deals down south. Do you see the equivalent of TIF or growth accelerator?
No. The reason I joined it, I mean, I'm still kind of doing kind of classic project finance stuff, but mainly in the kind of student accommodation area. So not really seen any TIF funding or anything, but I mean, it's not really my area of expertise. It's quite an interesting one though, isn't it? Because effectively, I'm assuming, Toby, you correct me on this, that it's basically the local authority that is raising the money, presumably through something like the Public Loan Works Board or or Scottish Government. So actually, it's not like you're transferring the risk to a SPV who's then borrowing the money. It's actually kind of like Keynesian in terms of government pump priming, I suppose, in terms of financing. Is that?
That's right. So it's a lot more. The risk is more with the public sector, but those things like the growth accelerator is things like St James's Centre here in Edinburgh. It's saying, well, actually, what if the local covers all the demolition costs, clears the site, puts in some of the facilitating infrastructure, might be net zero heating. It makes it more palatable for private sector money to then come in, because there's other things around it as well, like, supportive, like planning consents, etc. So there's lots of things around it, but that is more, I suppose, on the public sector risk side of things. Whereas, Peter's mentioning lots of the traditional projects, the PPP ones, there's a transfer risk to the special purpose vehicle, and the public sector authority or a public body has to pay for that, and it pays for those risks to be transferred, and the private sector will be responsible for sourcing the financing, operating, maintaining that building, and ensuring that the services are provided and are made available to the public sector. So what we've seen is, I suppose, back in the 90s, when in the early noughties, when I was involved, is there's still PPP projects ongoing, but actually what I've seen over time is now we're trying to expand that to say, well, in terms of public sector, they need to be a lot sharper in what they're, in the way they look at their assets. So they're saying, well, if we need a new school, well, what should we be doing with some of the existing schools? Are some in really old, dilapidated buildings? Should we knock them down and actually decamp pupils to a new school? Or likewise, could it be better to not have 2 or 3 smaller hospitals, but to mothball those and have one larger hospital and all the benefits and efficiencies from it? So there's a move to this sort of broader place-based investment decision making, and saying, well, what is it we actually need within a particular area, and how might those needs best be served? But you can imagine it is really complex, because as soon as you're involving private, businesses, individual homeowners and property owners, general public, so trying to corral or get things done, even if you're just dealing with different public sector bodies, so it could be the NHS, local authority, higher education institute, trying to get them all working together, even though they're in the public sector, can be really challenging. But it just seems a bit more, there is a move to this place-based decision making, to think what's best for the area. Things have heard the term 20-minute neighbourhoods. Apparently an ambition the Scottish Government is everybody should be within 20 minutes walking distance of work. Now, how practical is that? Maybe not, particularly if you're in London. That isn't going to happen, is it? But it's trying to think, what are these different policy objectives and how might they best be delivered for particular places, and particularly what the infrastructure needs, because it's not just the buildings. There's all of things like roads, EV infrastructure, digital infrastructure. All of these other assets are now coming into play. Scotland in particular, it's got really poor digital connectivity in rural areas, so it's a real challenge, because there's a big cost in trying to get that connectivity in place. How do you finance and fund it? Do you socialize those costs across the broader population? So there's lots of interesting questions and challenges. Thanks for that, Lewis.
Yeah, thanks as well.
And I'm not sure if you can see, Toby, there's been 2 questions that have come in.
Oh, okay.
In the chat. One from Benjamin and one from Mervyn.
Yeah. Okay. So it's quite. So Benjamin, one, I currently work in investment. Does one have to be an accountant to get into project finance? Absolutely not. No, plenty of people, historians, people who've studied medieval English literature have been involved in project finance. Yeah, I suppose as long as you've got an analytical mind, an appetite to learn, it's not hard to get into project finance. Yeah, it's you don't have to be an accountant. In fact, probably I think I trained as an accountant, and I think it's probably one of the worst things in some ways, because when as an accountant, you're always looking back, here's what's happened in the past. Oh yeah, let's record it, create the accounts. Whereas actually project finance, you're looking to the future. If we build this, what cash are we going to generate? What's our return going to be? So yeah, you don't have to be an accountant at all. Good financial modeler helps though. So yeah, hopefully that helps, Benjamin. But please, feel free to speak. I mean, there may be others here, because Peter, you're not you didn't train as an accountant, did you?
I didn't. No. I joined. I kind of started in banking basically, and started to build financial models from there. So yeah, I mean, I didn't train. I kind of went in pretty much straight into it. And as you say, it's kind of from a lot of the financial side was building the financial models and then arranging the financing and stuff like that. So a firm behind me, you can see some of our guys aren't kind of joined. We've got kind of a mixture of people who've trained as accountants and then people who just kind of come straight into it or kind of come from other backgrounds. So I don't think there's any kind of I would, as you say, I mean, it's 3 years or whatever you might spend training as an accountant. Actually, I think. Well, I mean, it's useful.
It was.
Yeah, you understand financial statements and so forth, which is important. It's part of model build, but I don't necessarily think it's kind of I think you could argue that you could get that kind of you'd be better to spend 3 years actually on the job learning to do it. But yeah, I mean, I don't see accountancy as a prerequisite for almost any job in financial management, maybe outside of financial SPV accounting and stuff like that. But
no, that's right. So yeah, Benjamin, you will not be disadvantaged. And Mervyn, you've got hi. Could you give an opinion on how social infrastructure finance can be made sustainable in developing countries, putting into considering the financial challenges? I was just going to ask Mervyn, do you want to come off mic, and do you just want to expand on that question a little bit? In terms of sustainable, do you mean sustainable in terms of it being green, or actually sustainable from being able to, keep building new projects? Just be helpful to get a bit of an idea of what you're aiming at for that.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Yeah, so my name is Amazing. I'm actually a civil engineer in Zambia. I'm basically, I have great interest in building social infrastructure. So basically my experience has been revolving around building healthcare centers and hospitals around the country. And then normally when I'm acting, I think the question that I get to ask is mostly these infrastructure projects are more dependent on either it's a grant or it's a loan, and most of these loans are gotten at commercial rates. So is there any way within your experience on how this finance could be made into cheaper and more sustainable, like in building more and more social infrastructure?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So it's interesting you mentioned grants. Yes, I actually see a lot of that on new areas of infrastructure investment where there's a new market. So actually people aren't keen to invest. So you can have grant, which helps give returns. But I suppose in the UK, the local authorities, they have access to their own sort of loan financing through something called the Public Works Loan Board, or borrowing from government. So that's, the public sector, I suppose, having access to its own financial resources. If you're going to external commercial banks, they're going to be charging commercial rates, and I'm not sure what they'll be like where you are, but of course those financing costs have increased substantially now. I suppose across the world following price in Ukraine, and interest rates here in the UK now at 5-6%, where historically they were down at sort of a base rate of sort of like 0.5%. But yeah, the cheap financing was really able to access through low or cheap public loans or subsidized loans being available. One of the things I have done is also, if you've got situations where you've got grant, instead of that grant being given away by the government, it still could be potentially given away. But what we tried to look at is say, well, that grant, in exchange, the public body gets an asset, let's say a financial instrument, and it might be, I don't know, preference shares or some form of equity, but it doesn't take a return on that. It waits to see if the project is successful, it's all working and operating, and then says, well, actually, what we can do now is we'll sell that stake onto a third party who can then access a return and say, well, actually, we'll get this interest rate, for instance, on that instrument. The government gets its grant back, and then it uses it to invest in another asset, hospital or school. So that's another way. But in effect, what you're doing is just recycling that initial grant money. So instead of the grant going out and it being gone forever, you use it to help unlock an investment. Once it's up and running, operating successfully, it's getting, say, revenue streams in or some source of funding. Government could then exit that asset, get its money back, and use it to invest that elsewhere. That may or may not help, Lewis. Mervyn, but I'm happy to chat separately about that. A good site to go to would be where there's lots of supporting information and things to look at is the World Bank. Go to World Bank website. They may have, they can also provide relatively cheap financing, but I suppose it just depends on the project. But if you want to chat separately about that, just drop me a line and we could set up a separate call.
Can I build on that a bit, Toby? Good afternoon, everyone, by the way.
Hi, Eric. How you doing?
Hi, Eric.
Yes, I'm doing great. How's it going for you guys? All good? Nice spell of weather, basically, in the UK. Finally, that's basically what I'm happy about at the moment. Well, anyway, just a brief intro, and then just building up maybe a bit on this, at least based on my experience or our experience. So I'm Eric Tomaszewski. I'm a director at Itoma Lux. We are a London-based front office for a couple of investment bank, FCA regulated, and basically we specialize mostly in the developing markets. Now, Mervyn, I couldn't hear exactly where you are coming from, basically which country, because your line wasn't the best. I'm going to assume that you are in one of the developing nations. And I think one of the answers, at least how we would approach that, would be to actually look at what we call DFIs, development finance institutions. So basically, this is something that we call a patient capital, usually. and they are commercial institutions. And an example basically for UK would be BII, British International Investment, which we are working with on a couple of projects. Another one would be German KfW, which is dealing in particular with the public projects, or perhaps its little sister called DEG, which is basically dealing with the private sector projects. Indeed, in the developing nations, again, they are looking at mostly the projects that are in the infrastructure sector, which is exactly what you're looking at. The rates might be sort of similar from our experience, let's say, to the local market, but again, they've got a bit more of the of patient capital. So let's say instead of standard maybe 5 years, they could go, let's say, for 8-10 years, maybe farther. At least that's our experience. So again, if you want to Google DFI, Development Finance Institutions, I'm sure you're gonna find a number of names. And again, different countries have different organizations. I already mentioned British ones. I already mentioned, let's say, German. France has, I think, 2 or 3 we work with. Yeah. Netherlands, practically every country in Europe has some. Yes,
and the other one worth mentioning is probably EBRD, European Bank Reconstruction Development. That'd be another useful one. World Bank.
EBRD. So again, they invest in Europe plus North Africa and post-Soviet republics. Maybe not exactly, Central or West Africa, at least from our experience. So yeah, EBRD, that's another one, and a couple of others. Again, I'm gonna post my LinkedIn if anyone wants to connect potential, let's say, to discuss some of this stuff. Hopefully this is gonna help some of you guys.
That sounds good, Mervyn, to connect with you, Eric. That'll be quite handy.
That certainly is helpful.
Again, we are an FCA regulated investment bank. I was actually going to ask about social infrastructure, let's say, before Mervyn's question, and indeed going in this direction that I've just gone. For example, and I don't know, Toby, if you consider this indeed social infrastructure, we currently have been contracted maybe 4 months ago, basically, and beginning of the year, on affordable development project in India, Pune-Mumbai area, or simply West India. And indeed, this DFI don't work or consider it speculative investment, affordable housing or residential. So they prefer infrastructure, they prefer renewables. I wonder, maybe from anyone's experience here, your Toby or anyone else, do you know any institutions that indeed deal with affordable housing, residential, and so on? Because as I said, from our experience, all of these DFIs actually go for infrastructure, while residential development, for whatever reasons, they consider speculative. So just wondering if on the international markets, anyone here has heard, of any DFIs that actually don't consider, residential speculative. Just, a question on the off chance that maybe someone had some experience. I think this is a good forum to ask this. Anyone? If not, I'm gonna move on. Okay.
Yeah, but it's funny enough, though, Eric, it's a really interesting question, because like even here, like in Scotland, I think across the globe, affordable housing is a real issue for all countries.
Indeed.
I mean, so actually, like Scottish government has got, obviously it needs to build 200,000 new affordable homes, which, to give a bit of context, for Scotland, there's a total of 2.4 million homes. So basically another 10% just to help people, move away from, expensive private sector landlords and maybe be able to buy their own affordable homes. So it's a real challenge, and particularly because by the time cost of land, and then the developers, charging the margins, it's like, how do you unlock that? So if anybody does have a solution, let Eric and I know.
And based on data, even in the UK, based on 2020 data that I've got on hand and I've been using in some of our webinars that we've been organizing, even in the UK, yes, 5th richest country in the world, I think 2020, 180 or 90,000 residential dwellings were developed, while the government says we need approximately 300,000. there's like a gap of 50 to 70% of this, which is why that's where the money is potentially needed. Or we've got another office in Lagos, Nigeria, for West Africa, and again, Lagos has huge problem with indeed residential housing. And again, all of these DFIs that have patient capital for all of the solar project, wind project, or anything like that, say, look, we don't want to go towards residential, it's too speculative. That's indeed the issue that we're facing. Hence, I thought I'm gonna put this question on this forum. Again, infrastructure, especially renewables, I think there's a lot of money around, but there are specific types of projects that potentially, need this capital. Anyway, guys, I think that's me. Sorry for overtaking the session, Toby.
No, but it's good because actually, is it just something as simple? I sometimes think things like that is that, but it's not that they think it's more retail type. If you're thinking of individual houses, individual homeowners, let's say, it's 100,000, people are like, not interested. We want to invest in a 20, 30, 40 million pound project where there's a single sort of other counterparty we've got to worry about. So actually, for some of these things, do you need to have some form of aggregation vehicle, to get the big lumps of money coming in, which then get fed down into the supply chain? I don't know.
Hi. Sorry, guys. It's Benjamin here. If I may pivot then slightly this conversation to the other sustainability definition, if you like, and this particularly is around organizations who are potentially looking for project financing for infrastructure projects, but are facing hurdles due to the sort of sustainability drive, and where organizations now need to have credible transition plans towards maybe moving away from fossil fuels, or at least diversifying and demonstrating how they transition over time to greener solutions. I'm interested in what kind of things you guys are seeing from a project financing perspective, where it may involve helping clients to model a transitional view of their projects, as well as a more sort of sustainable package overall for funders to consider.
Open that one up to the floor. So anyone got any thoughts on that? Because if anyone does, I mean, one of the things I've been seeing, Benjamin, I'm working on, net zero buildings, and there's a big drive in looking at, in Europe, there's the EU, the green taxonomy, in the UK. So it's sort of ESG, environmental, social and governance reporting frameworks. So I think from this year, but there's some mandatory ESG reporting requirements. So I think there's just general pressure in the landscape for actually moving towards becoming green. Because if you don't, if you're looking at a series of companies and you look at their ESG requirements, so all this thing about greenwashing, people saying they're green and not really doing anything, actually looking at them and saying, well, this is a green, sustainable organization that will attract, cheaper money from, investors looking for green assets. So there's a general pressure, I think, for people moving to creating greener, sustainable projects and asset classes. I've been involved in something called the European Energy Efficiency Mortgage Initiative, which is trying to create a green mortgage label, so that, and the background to that is that, let's say you have a home which has a greenness rating, EPC performance rating of B or C, D, E, F or G, but the greener it is, what people are finding is that could get a green mortgage label attached to it. And for banks, you have a whole series of these loans, which are then deemed green assets, and they can then actually securitize those and sell them, or attract cash in from European, like covered bond markets. So get lots of green capital coming in, which is cheaper, which are then hoping will fuel further investment. So, for me, if I was to go and buy next home, I might look to say, well, actually, is it green? Does it meet certain regulatory standards? Is it EPC C or better? And maybe I could go to a lender and actually get a cheaper rate of financing if it is. Now, I don't know. That's just my experience of what is happening in terms of trying to transition through to more, greener, more sustainable projects. But it's still, so as you say, it's still in transition. There's nothing definitive yet. I just see this sort of like pressure building for people to actually come up with. If I have a project and come up with it, I need to have a business case which says, I come to you, Benjamin, and say, look, it's green, it's a wind farm, and it's doing all of these other good things. We're investing in the local community, we're using recycled materials, all of that good stuff, which could attract potentially others as green investors into investing in that project, as opposed to something else which doesn't have any green credentials whatsoever.
That's right.
I think that's coming.
I guess what I wonder is whether or not in creating financial models, there are anything specifically that need to be shown to account for the ESG element, or perhaps that's not really a financial modeling.
Well, it's good. It's a good point. You're probably not necessarily going to capture it directly in the financial model. You might see some of that ESG stuff captured within the documentation. The only thing I'm thinking where there might be something green is, I suppose, actually the project itself. But I don't know if you've got maybe using carbon offset credits. There's those are being sold or something like that. I don't know. Eric, looks like you want to jump in on that. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just maybe a couple, just a few. So what we used before, basically, for some projects, I think that was in US and maybe one in West Africa, was indeed a calculation how much CO2 a given project is gonna be, let's say, saving compared to a current technology. So that was basically one of the things. I'll give you an example. We've been indeed based on our US clients from, I think that was over a year ago when we got engaged on this deal. So basically they came with some technology to recycle asphalt shingles, which is basically what you've got on the, on the rooftops. So it's basically an oil-based product to cover the roofs, a bit more economic than, standard stuff that you've got on the roof. And basically they wanted to convert it back into zero cost oil. And this is an example of the project where they said, look, with our technology, basically we can save X million of tons of CO2 or whatever, basically, if we scale to certain level and so on. So that was one of the things that we found has been useful, especially at the initial indication of interest from the investors. And again, ESG obviously have quite big political capital at the moment. Everyone is about ESG, save this CO2, carbon credits, and so on. On top of that, I think in the model itself, everyone is looking. I'm not the specialist modeler. Yes, I'm not definitely as good as Toby here. Toby, I'm sure, is basically the best guy on this webinar. I'm more of generalist, and I used to be in project management before. In the model, I think the main stuff that people are looking are, again, any sort of coverage ratios, and that's basically the main thing. Correct me if I'm wrong, Toby, on this stuff. Again, it's not something specific to ESG. The main thing is basically that the project is gonna be sufficiently de-risked to take it from there. But when you build your your teaser, your business plans and stuff like that. It's all about getting this initial interest. Our project is going to save this many tons of CO2 or whatever. This is going to be carbon offsetting. This is basically, how we can potentially save on some tipping cost. Tipping basically, that instead of this asphalt shingles example, going to the actual landfill, it would become again zero cost oil. Yes, so that's another thing basically that has been underlined in this business case that we've been working a year ago. These are just the examples. Yes, it's specific to the project, but this is what comes to my mind. If no one else contributes, I didn't want Toby to be the only person.
No, that's great, Eric.
Okay. So that's a few pennies from my side.
Yeah,
thanks, guys.
That's really helpful, Eric, because like other projects I've been involved with, so street lighting, that's one where conversion of these sodium discharge lanterns to LEDs, huge carbon saving. And actually you see it's just a metric. You see the current emission for electricity costs, you're saving a massive amount of electricity. And in the UK, you've got emission factors associated with that. So say the level of electricity consumed has gone down, here's the emission factor. So you can equate that to the carbon saving. So it's good. It's a nice output, but it's not monetized in any way. It's just adds to sort of a local authority saying, oh, we've got a target to reduce our emissions by 90%, over the next 20 years. Here's a demonstration of what it's done. It's not been there's been no value monetized in terms of being able to sell those, I suppose, carbon offsets or the benefit. But what it has done has created the momentum and the impetus to invest in the project, because it's like, oh, if we invest in this, we've got this amount of carbon saving. But when you look at the model, all that you see is electricity consumption is reduced. You've got the costs of setting the scheme up. You've got to buy the lanterns. There's nothing which is sort of a green finance line per se, saying, oh, this is income being generated, which could be given a green label. It's just been the carbon saving that's been tangible. It's just a metric. It's not contributing in any way to the financing and funding of a project. It's just made it more attractive. But I think that it'll be more of a case. I know there are, markets now where you can actually start to trade some of your carbon savings or carbon offsets. So funny enough, we've been chatting to Glasgow here in Scotland, where it's a housing project, and they're looking to retrofit the housing. They've got a baseline of carbon emissions, and they're saying, if we undertake this project, this is how much it'll cost. It will say get these energy savings, but it'll also get these carbon savings, which they are then actually selling on a market to others, to industrial providers or other organizations, to help them offset their emissions. So they're just selling those, and actually that's beginning to come in as an actual revenue stream. Now, I know in the UK, and this is sort of really at the limits of my knowledge, but there's emissions trading schemes. So those have been sort of at large scale, industrial scale, but maybe we get to a point where those carbon credits become sort of a retail product. So if we individually were to do something to our house and improve, or reduce carbon emissions, and we could validate it, could we actually get some money for that? I don't know. I mean, I think we're still in early days for lots of that. But yeah, anybody else got any thoughts on that? Says Eric and myself chatting all the time.
Well, thanks to you both for that contribution. Thank you.
No problems, Benjamin.
A good thing is to actually see at the main KPIs that organizations, that are financing the projects, or that are sponsoring the projects actually report to their stakeholders? Do they report on CO2 and, or what else, if it goes about environmental factors, do they report on? And then actually, just go with your proposal and put some numbers indeed against some KPIs they report to their stakeholders.
Yeah.
Okay, that would be me. Thanks, guys.
Brilliant. Take care, Eric.
Cheers. Thanks.
Okay, what should we do? If any of us got any questions or thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the community is open for member questions. You guys are free to post any in the community. You can tag Toby directly, or any of the other members that you've met here, or during some of our other events. And yes, I think that's it. We have an upcoming webinar with Toby on 3-statement modeling on the 22nd of June, if I'm not mistaken, right, Toby?
Yeah, so that one will be more of
a little more
like show and tell. I'll be fingers on the keyboard, just so it'll be more, I suppose it's a thought, is it, Tia? We're trying to think of doing more technical type webinars where it's just to
modeling,
more educational knowledge sharing of 3 financial statements. So one of the things people
seems to be some of the most popular webinars. So we will be doing more of that over the next couple of months, starting with Toby's one in June.
Yeah, so if you want to understand the difference between direct and indirect cash flow modeling, that will be the webinar for you.
Thank you, Toby. And yes, thanks everybody for joining. We will be publishing the recording of this session in the community within the next 24 hours. So that should be available inside our webinar recordings area by end of the day tomorrow. And that's everything from my side. If you have any additional questions for me about courses, platform, navigation around the platform, feel free to let me know. You can always find me by searching for my name, Thea Kuseva. On the top right corner of your screen, you also have a messages functionality, so you can talk to me on there as well. And I think that's it. Thank you guys for joining.
Yeah, take care everyone, and see you all soon.
Thanks, guys.
I like your character. Superb.
Yeah. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.